One of the most common questions I get while live streaming is, hey, can you tell me what is good secondary stats on my items, or how do I tell if I got a good drop in terms of gear? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain to you today not only what makes a good drop, but how to determine if a drop is good for your build. Now, let's assume that an item drops in the wild and it shows up and it has 4 lines of stats, and now you're thinking, okay, do these 4 lines of stats correlate with my build? Well, the way that you're going to actually figure this out is the first thing you're going to do is you're going to look at whatever your primary ability is. You're going to look at all of them, but for the sake of the beginning, you're going to look at your primary ability and you're going to see the tags that are correlated with it. For instance, if I look at my tornado, it says it is a core skill, it is a storm skill, it is a werewolf, it is a nature magic, and it is a shape-shifting. Now, if we go to our abilities, we can do this with all of our abilities and start to understand how whatever build we're using, we can start to understand what tags these have. Once we understand what tags, like it's shape-shifting, nature magic, etc., we can start to realize when we get drops, for instance, like total armor while in werewolf form, we can start to understand how that will synergize with each and every one of our abilities. Then we can dig a little bit further and see what effects our abilities proc. For instance, Hurricane for us is not only going to apply slow, we are also going to apply vulnerable. So I know when I got my weapon, +2 vulnerable damage would be good for me because I am in fact using vulnerable. But I also knew from looking at my weapon that damage to slowed enemies was going to work as well because I have a slow for my Hurricane. I also knew that damage with crowd control was going to work because you can click and hover over all these and it explains how the mechanic works, and crowd control itself is in fact included as a slow. So because I have slow for my primary abilities, then I know that damage to crowd control slowed werewolf skills, because again, my tornado is werewolf, I can see that there, as well as vulnerable damage. These are all going to work with my primary damage dealing ability. Therefore, this is a pretty good row in terms of secondary stats, and I can consider it as long as things like damage per second in the primary stats are still strong enough for me. So the first thing we have to do before we get into the conversation of talking about which rows are best in each one of these slots is what skills are we using, what effects do they proc, and what tags do they have? So now that we understand the basic concept of what your abilities actually do in terms of effects they proc and tags that they have, we can start to understand how to build our character. Now, each slot offers something different in potential rows. The weapons are obviously going to bring damage stats. The gloves are additionally going to bring damage stats, but also the ability to get rows in like your core abilities. And these core abilities are very often your primary damage stat dealer as well. So we're very often going to be looking for damage stats from these two. The amulets can have damage stats, but can also, in addition, have things like percentage to total stats, can have armor, cooldown reduction, you can have movement speed, for instance, as well as ranks in passive stats that can be crucially important. And passive stats, for instance, like wild impulses or crushing earth, maybe if you're going to do the earth build, can be massive increases of damage output as well. So we want to keep an eye out on these different ones for damage stats. We also have the rings, which in and of themselves can also have damage stats. So the offensive ones that we're really looking at are weapons, gloves, amulets, and both rings, with an emphasis on the gloves because the gloves can have those core stat rank upgrades, as well as things like critical strike chance, critical strike damage, lucky hit chance, etc. And then when we're talking about the aspects, the gloves themselves can be replaced more often as the aspects don't get a bonus. See, this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. You see, on two-handed weapons and amulets, you get a bonus with your aspects, meaning you want your better aspects to go on them, meaning you're going to replace these less often. So you want to be a little bit more picky in your selection of things like weapons and amulets in terms of the rows on them before you place your legendary aspects on them, as they are more than likely going to have your most important aspects. So as a recap, we know weapon, gloves, amulet, and rings have opportunities for offensive stats. The chest plate is in between this and defensive because the chest plate can have offensive stats, but as well as defensive stats. For instance, we can have an increase to physical damage, which I know is good for my build because when I look at my tornado, we can have here a physical modifier I can see at the bottom, so I know this does physical damage. It actually tells you what type of damage your abilities do when you look at them. So I know increasing my physical damage with my chest plate is going to be very good. I also know that I do, in fact, inflict poison on them due to my Paragon board. So damage reduction from enemies that are poisoned is going to be good as well. Your chest plate can either go defensive or offensive rows like damage reduction or just pure damage, depending upon what you actually need currently out of your build. This is more of a flex type of row. I don't believe the same is for the pants, however. I believe the pants are fairly defensive rows. This is a unique pant, so it's not a very good example because it's going to have the same one. My uniques are going to have the same rows that all of them have. But on pants, you can actually get damage reduction percentages. And these damage reduction percentages can be things that multi-stack. So you can get a 4-row of like damage reduction while fortified, damage reduction while injured, damage reduction from close enemies, just straight up damage reduction. So you can get a quad row stat of tons of damage reduction. So your pants, if you're feeling like you're getting one shot all the time or you're having trouble surviving, your pants can be your key to victory when it comes to survivability. So just kind of keep that in mind and don't throw away, an opportunity of some pants to maybe have a quad row, because you have that, you throw the disobedience aspect on for extra armor, suddenly you're just a lot more tanky. Now, the helmets, I don't really like the options too much. There's a couple good options. You can get things like total armor and cooldown reduction and basic skill attack speed. I like these if you're using builds that can actually take part of these. Total armor is good. You can get raw stats, for instance, like intelligence, dexterity, what have you. I don't really like things like life on kill. I don't really like things like resistance percentages, because we can get these from rings, we can get these from amulets, and I don't really like things like healing received. My logic is essentially this, that I would rather have the damage incoming be reduced than after I receive the damage, try to heal it. So for that reason, I'm not really looking for things like healing percentages. So this row for me would be like a 2 out of 10. I absolutely hate this row because I have a low row on basic skill, attack percentage. I have barrier generation, which again, I don't care about. I have healing generation. I don't really care about that. And then I just have some dexterity stats. Whereas something maybe like this one where I have cooldown reduction as well as armor, I'm valuing a little bit higher because now I'm a little bit more survivable and my abilities to actually do damage are coming up more often. So just kind of keep in mind, min-max what it is that works for your build. For instance, Grizzly Rage is a huge part of my build, so having cooldown reduction is keyly important. So if I was going to use a helmet that wasn't unique, I'm probably going to have cooldown reduction in order for me to be interested in the helmet. Now, the boots for me are fairly simple. I want movement speed. I am a person who likes to go fast. Yes, I can get movement speed on the amulet as well, but I would rather have cooldown reduction. I would rather have either tanky stats or damage stats on this amulet. I would rather have ranks of passives, etc. Then I would rather have movement speed, which I can get on the boots. The reason for this is the boots really are only going to offer a few things. It's either going to offer raw stats, dodge chance, which I don't mind dodge chance, or you're going to get resistances, or you're going to get some movement speed. So for me personally, I either actually really like movement speed on the boots because this is one of the most efficient places to get them, and only you're really costing yourself something like poison resistance or something in order to get something like movement speed. The other part of this movement speed is actually damage reduction in and of itself because you're dodging things more often and you're keeping away from the melee mobs more often than when you're going slow. So for that reason, it's a bit of uncalculable damage mitigation. So for that reason, I actually quite like movement speed. Obviously, when we're talking about things like weapons and we're talking about the rings, we're just looking for critical strike damage, vulnerable damage, critical strike chance, damage to whatever skills you're using, like rare skills, etc. We're looking for damage, okay, on these rows. We're looking for the big ones. Mostly we want critical strike chance. If we're not using something that's going to give us 100% critical strike chance, we're really looking for those types of stats. So I feel like those rings are fairly obvious. Get the ones to synergize with the tags for your build, and it should be simple to understand both weapons and rings from there, as well as gloves. It's just pure damage stats. There is one additional stat for hardcore that's kind of interesting, which is you can actually get like +4 potion capacity. So I can actually go up to like 13 potions if I get certain pants. And for that reason, if you're running a hardcore early and you get these, that might be kind of interesting when you go into a boss so you're like locked in there. I know there's like cheesy ways to get out of it, but if you're in there like locked 1-0, I'm not locked in here with you, you're locked in with me, like maybe having more potions might actually be kind of nice. But for the most part, when it comes to this, we know helmet's going to have some utility and a little bit of raw stats or damage reduction type of stuff. Okay, that's pretty much what we're looking at with these helmets. Maybe some percentage resistances, maybe some cooldown reduction, maybe some raw stats. Okay, cooldown reduction being at premium. The chest plate's going to be your flex pick, either defensive or offensive stats. Your gloves are going to be offensive for sure, looking for plus ranks in the real big skill that you're using. Your pants, you want defensive modifiers. Your boots, you want utility, and what kind of what raw stats you can get is fine. If you have to take percentages, sure. I like defensive type of ones on the boots and movement speed. Your weapon, you're just looking for raw damage. Okay, if you're looking like an offhand or something like the totem, for instance, on the druid, cooldown reduction. But if you're using a two-hand, we're looking for just the biggest dick damage that we got. The amulets, we're looking for a mix of things like you can get percentage for your actual main stat, which is why I did willpower being my main stat. So I have a maximum roll of 10.9% willpower roll, just raw stat increase, which is really good, especially for things like Paragon boards if you're having problems unlocking those. And then I'm looking for things like armor percentage, your stat percentage, cooldown reduction, etc. I don't like this row too much, but you can see I do have damage reduction. I have some cooldown, I have some armor, etc. I also like movement speed in here. You can get movement speed after killing an elite, which is interesting. I don't think that's good. I would rather have that on boots. Once again, you can get that on boots. So you can get like movement speed plus movement speed after killing an elite on the boots, which means I don't have to hammer on the amulet, giving me another potential for damage on the amulet. Definitely like cooldown on the amulet. However, I also think there's one other point, which is that you can get damage percentage after killing an elite on pants. So one of the only ways to get increased damage on pants is by having the increased damage percentage after killing an elite. So if you notice those on pants, I think that's actually a little bit better potentially than having like a fourth defensive modifier, because that is a percentage damage row that you can't get any other damage on pants. So it's the only way to increase your damage. As far as gems go, I pretty much run HP percentage, but if you're running certain dungeons, like if you're doing Champion's Demise over and over again for XP, for instance, you could run like lightning resistance. Here, you can get percentages in here. I use armor in here strictly because armor reduces your physical damage, but also reduces your non-physical damage as well, taken according to your armor contribution. So I'm just using armor, because armor for me seems to be saving my life more times than not, and I'm getting resist percentages from the base stats on these literally anyway, so it hasn't been too much of a problem for me. But you can target specific percentages here if you are target farming certain areas or you're only using certain sigils kind of at the higher end. So that's kind of my rundown. It's not super in detail, but hopefully it helps you understand to match your effects of your skills, the tags of your skills, with the secondary stats to roll with your items, and you can take it with your brain from there. Love you all. Do consider subscribing. We are so close to 100,000. I've been trying for 5 years, and we're basically right there. Thank you to each and every one of you. Not to get too sappy, but this is very exciting. Have a great day.